Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The rise of Daniel Grant. Daniel Grant's journey to the pinnacle of the aviation world was one of perseverance, ingenuity, and determination. Born in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, Daniel's early life was far from glamorous. His parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet. His father held 2 jobs as a factory worker, and his mother ran a small catering business out of their kitchen. Despite the financial struggles, the household was rich with love and an unyielding emphasis on education. From a young age, Daniel showed an insatiable curiosity about how things worked. While other kids played video games, he pored over books about engineering and business, dreaming of building something extraordinary. His high school teachers quickly noticed his brilliance, often remarking on his sharp analytical mind and relentless drive. Winning a scholarship to a prestigious university was just the beginning. Daniel majored in business administration and minored in engineering, blending his 2 passions seamlessly. During his college years, Daniel's entrepreneurial spirit began to shine. He founded a small tech startup with a group of friends, focusing on creating software solutions for small businesses. Though the venture was modest, it taught him invaluable lessons about leadership, innovation, and resilience. By the time he graduated, Daniel had already been featured in several business magazines as a rising star to watch. After college, Daniel joined a global consulting firm, where he quickly rose through the ranks. Known for his strategic acumen and ability to think 10 steps ahead, he earned the respect of his colleagues and clients alike. But consulting was never the endgame for Daniel. His ultimate dream was to revolutionize the aviation industry, a sector he had been fascinated with since childhood. In his early 30s, Daniel took the leap and founded his own airline, SkyPoint Airways. Unlike the established giants in the industry, SkyPoint focused on providing a premium experience at a competitive price. With a commitment to sustainability and customer service, the airline grew rapidly, becoming a favorite among both business and leisure travelers. But success did not come without challenges. As a Black entrepreneur in a predominantly white industry, Daniel often faced skepticism and outright prejudice. Competitors underestimated him, and potential investors questioned his ability to succeed. Instead of letting these obstacles deter him, Daniel used them as fuel. He built alliances, recruited top talent, and continually outperformed expectations. Years later, SkyPoint Airways had become a global powerhouse, and Daniel was celebrated as one of the most influential leaders in aviation. His latest move, a bold acquisition of a struggling but prestigious European airline, was the culmination of years of hard work and strategic planning. As the deal was finalized, Daniel allowed himself a moment to breathe. The acquisition was a game-changer, positioning SkyPoint as a dominant player in the international market. The next step was to meet with the new executive team in London to chart the path forward. It was a moment he had envisioned countless times, yet the weight of it still felt surreal. With his suitcase packed and boarding pass in hand, Daniel arrived at the airport. The hustle and bustle of travelers rushing to their gates reminded him of how far he had come, from a young boy dreaming of the skies to the owner of one of the world's most talked-about airlines. As he approached the check-in counter, he noticed the subtle glances from the staff. Dressed in a tailored navy suit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase, Daniel exuded confidence and professionalism. Yet, he was no stranger to the assumptions people made based on his appearance. The thought crossed his mind, but he brushed it aside. The agent at the counter scanned his ticket and handed him a sleek envelope with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Grant," she said, her tone polite yet formal. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement, making his way toward the security checkpoint. The atmosphere shifted as he entered the VIP lounge. Executives in suits, some scrolling through their phones, others engaged in hushed conversations, filled the room. Daniel took a seat by the window, his thoughts drifting to the meeting ahead. He had no doubt about his ability to lead the new team, but he also knew that success would require earning their trust and respect, a challenge he had faced countless times before. When it was finally time to board, Daniel approached the gate. The agent scanned his boarding pass without issue, but as he stepped onto the jet bridge, he noticed the flight attendant at the entrance eyeing him. Her practiced smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. "Good evening, sir," she said, her tone professional, but slightly reserved. "Your seat is just down the aisle to the left." Daniel thanked her and made his way to seat 2A, the perfect spot for a quiet, comfortable flight. Settling into the spacious leather chair, he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The past week had been a whirlwind, and he was ready to relax and recharge before the next chapter began. But the tranquility was short-lived. As other passengers began boarding, Daniel noticed a subtle but palpable shift in the atmosphere. A few whispered conversations, furtive glances, and an unmistakable tension filled the air. He had experienced this before, a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and, sometimes, resentment. It wasn't long before a middle-aged man in an expensive suit stopped by his seat. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone cold and condescending. "I think you might be in the wrong seat." Daniel looked up, his expression calm but firm. "This is seat 2A, he said, holding up his boarding pass. The man glanced at the pass, then at Daniel, his skepticism evident. "Well, I'm sure there's been some kind of mistake," he muttered before calling over a flight attendant. The flight attendant arrived, her smile strained as she looked between Daniel and the man. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "I believe this gentleman might be in the wrong section," the man said, his tone dripping with arrogance. The attendant looked at Daniel's boarding pass and nodded. "Mr. Grant is in the correct seat," she said, her voice neutral but firm. The man's face flushed, and he mumbled something under his breath before walking away. Daniel watched him go, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, and he doubted it would be the last. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Daniel leaned back in his seat, determined not to let the incident ruin his flight. Little did he know, the events of the next few hours would not only challenge his patience, but also reveal a truth that would leave everyone on board in awe. Quiet storm on the flight. The hum of the engines vibrated faintly through the cabin as the business class section began to settle. Passengers unpacked their belongings, flight attendants moved swiftly to ensure everyone was comfortable, and the clink of glasses echoed softly as champagne was poured. Daniel Grant watched the scene unfold around him, trying to ease back into his thoughts. He always appreciated the silence of flights. There were no meetings, no phone calls, no distractions. Just the uninterrupted passage of time at 30,000 feet. But that peace was short-lived. Not more than 15 minutes after takeoff, as the plane began to stabilize at cruising altitude, Daniel noticed murmurs again. It was the kind of sound that seemed insignificant to most, but to someone as observant as him, it felt oddly pointed. He could sense the unease, the occasional glance cast in his direction from other passengers, and the subtle but undeniable tension lingering in the air. He could tell the whispers weren't about turbulence or flight delays. It wasn't paranoia, this was a familiar script. Over the years, Daniel had grown accustomed to subtle and sometimes blatant assumptions made about him, especially in spaces he was told he didn't belong. Whether it was a boardroom, a five-star restaurant, or the premium cabin of an airplane, there was always someone who raised an eyebrow. He had worked tirelessly to ignore it, to let his success speak louder than anyone's prejudice. But sometimes, like today, it found a way to gnaw at him. And then came the direct confrontation. A woman seated 2 rows behind him, a well-dressed older passenger with platinum gray hair and a sharp gaze, signaled to a flight attendant. Daniel's ears perked up as her hushed voice drifted toward him. "Excuse me," the woman began, her tone crisp but civil. "I think there's been a mistake with the seating arrangements. There seems to be someone who, well, he may not belong here." The flight attendant, visibly flustered, leaned in to address her complaint. "Madam, I assure you that all passengers seated here have been verified. Is there a specific concern I can assist with?" The woman's expression turned icy, and her voice lowered, though it was still audible enough for Daniel to hear. "That gentleman in seat 2A, I simply find it unusual that he's traveling business class. Are you certain his ticket is valid?" For a fleeting second, Daniel closed his eyes, as if willing himself to maintain composure. He unclenched his fists slowly, inhaling through his nose, exhaling through his mouth. Before the flight attendant could respond, another passenger, a younger man in his 30s, chimed in. Honestly, I noticed him too. Some people always seem to game the system these days. He shot a brief glance at Daniel before smirking smugly at his seatmate, as though sharing an inside joke. The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, raised her hands in an attempt to defuse the situation. I can assure you, all tickets have been checked. Mr. Grant is seated appropriately. Daniel chose silence, as he often did in situations like these. He didn't need to defend himself, not to strangers. Yet, as the whispers carried on and the tension mounted, he found himself reflecting on why these experiences persisted. He wasn't dressed down or unkempt. On the contrary, his navy suit was sharp, tailored to perfection, and his polished leather shoes reflected the cabin lights like a mirror. He carried himself with confidence, moved with purpose. And yet, none of that mattered to those who made their assumptions based on the color of his skin or the space they thought he didn't deserve to occupy. The whispers died down after the flight attendant walked away, but the residue of judgment lingered like a bitter taste in the air. For the next 30 minutes, Daniel buried himself in work, tapping through financial spreadsheets and company projections on his tablet. He refused to let the pettiness of others distract him, though every so often he'd feel another passenger's eyes flicker toward him. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the senior flight attendants approached Daniel's seat with an apologetic smile. She was a tall woman with a composed presence and an air of authority. Mr. Grant, she said softly, leaning down so only he could hear. May I have a word with you in private? Daniel arched a brow but nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and rising from his chair. Several passengers shot curious glances his way as he followed the flight attendant down the aisle and into the galley near the front of the plane. The hum of the engines grew louder in the confined space, but here, away from prying eyes, the woman's demeanor shifted slightly. Mr. Grant, she began, I wanted to personally apologize for any discomfort you've experienced so far. Unfortunately, there's been some unpleasantness among the other passengers. Daniel tilted his head slightly, crossing his arms. I've noticed, he said dryly. The attendant's shoulders sank slightly, her professionalism softening into something more human. I assure you, this isn't how we want our guests to feel. I'm embarrassed this has even come up. Daniel offered her a small, polite smile. It's not the first time. It probably won't be the last. She hesitated before continuing, clearly trying to choose her words carefully. I didn't want to pry, but there's been speculation about whether you belong in this cabin. I know it's none of my business, but would it be inappropriate for me to ask? Daniel held up a hand to stop her, his voice calm and steady. I own the airline. The flight attendant froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening as the weight of his words sank in. I'm sorry? You heard me, Daniel repeated, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I own the airline. Skypoint Airways. I purchased this European carrier just last week. For a moment, the woman's shock left her speechless. Then her expression transformed into one of genuine surprise and admiration. I had no idea. Mr. Grant, I can't tell you how honored we are to have you on board. I don't even know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Daniel replied calmly. I didn't come here to make a scene. I came to relax and enjoy the flight. The flight attendant stood straighter now, her respect for him palpable. Of course, sir. I'll make sure everything is perfect for you for the remainder of the flight. And please know, any further issues with passengers will be addressed immediately. Daniel nodded. Thank you. I appreciate that. As he returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted ever so slightly. Word of his status hadn't yet spread to the other passengers, but Daniel felt no need to reveal it. If anything, he found satisfaction in the knowledge that he didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Still, as he settled back into his chair and picked up his tablet, he couldn't help but smile faintly. The passengers who had judged him so quickly were in for an awakening, but that revelation could wait. For now, he'd let them wonder. The irony, Daniel thought, was that he didn't care about their approval. The true mark of success was knowing his worth, regardless of anyone else's assumptions. And soon, they would realize just how far beyond their assumptions he truly was. The moment of realization. As the flight continued its smooth journey over the Atlantic, Daniel returned to his work, his focus sharpened by years of practice in ignoring the unnecessary noise around him. While the judgment and whispers from his fellow passengers had irritated him, they were nothing new. What mattered was the mission ahead, the next chapter in SkyPoint Airways' success story. His tablet buzzed softly as an email notification popped up. It was from his newly appointed executive team in London, eager to finalize their strategy for the coming months. Daniel began drafting his responses, carefully outlining priorities, timelines, and expectations. His ability to think strategically and articulate his vision had been central to his success. He had never been the loudest voice in the room, but his quiet, competent leadership had a way of commanding respect. Unbeknownst to him, however, the wheels of change were already turning within the cabin. The senior flight attendant, still processing Daniel's revelation, had shared the information with the purser and a few members of the crew. They were stunned. The man in seat 2A, the subject of whispered speculation and veiled judgments, owned the airline they were currently flying for. The purser, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence, quickly decided to address the situation discreetly. He approached the two passengers who had caused the most trouble earlier, the gray-haired woman and the smug young businessman. His voice was low but firm, his professional demeanor unyielding. "Madam, sir, I must inform you that the gentleman you questioned earlier is Mr. Daniel Grant, the owner of this airline. I'm sure you can appreciate how uncomfortable your behavior has made this flight for both him and our crew. We kindly ask that you show the respect due to all passengers." The older woman's face paled instantly. Her eyes widened in disbelief as the purser's words sank in. "Owner of the airline," she echoed weakly, as though she had misheard him. "Yes, madam. SkyPoint Airways is Mr. Grant's company, and he recently acquired this carrier. This is his flight as much as it is yours." The young businessman, who had joined in the earlier judgment, looked equally stunned. His cocky demeanor vanished, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and panic. I didn't realize," he stammered, glancing toward Daniel's seat. "Well," the purser said coolly, "perhaps this will be a lesson in not making assumptions." As the purser moved back toward the galley, the two passengers exchanged mortified glances. The gray-haired woman sank into her seat, her posture stiff with shame, while the younger man avoided looking anywhere near Daniel's direction. Word began to ripple subtly through the cabin. Passengers who had been silent observers now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whispers of "he owns the airline," and "that's Daniel Grant," floated through the air, though no one dared to look directly at him. Daniel's quiet power. Daniel, of course, noticed the shift. It was impossible not to. The same passengers who had looked at him with suspicion earlier now avoided eye contact altogether. Others seemed eager to hide their earlier judgments beneath polite smiles or hushed conversations. He didn't feel satisfaction, nor did he feel anger. What he felt, more than anything, was a quiet confirmation of what he had always known, that perceptions could be powerful, but they could also be painfully shallow. As the flight attendant refilled his glass with champagne, she gave him a respectful nod. "Mr. Grant, is there anything else I can bring you?" "No, thank you," Daniel replied warmly. "You've been excellent." Her smile was genuine, a reflection of her appreciation for his calm and dignified demeanor. For the remainder of the flight, Daniel found himself reflecting on the larger picture. The assumptions made about him on this plane were the same ones made about so many others who dared to rise above their circumstances. It wasn't just him, it was every entrepreneur, leader, or dreamer who looked different, who didn't fit someone else's narrow idea of success. He thought back to his childhood in Atlanta. How many times had he been told to dream smaller, to take what he was given instead of striving for more. How many times had he seen his parents, hard-working, brilliant people, dismissed because of who they were? This wasn't about a single seat on an airplane. It was about the spaces people thought they didn't deserve to occupy, and how that narrative could be rewritten. Daniel glanced out the window, the endless sky stretching before him. It was a fitting metaphor, he thought, for life itself. The limits people placed on you often had nothing to do with reality, they were only projections of their own insecurities and ignorance. And he had shattered every single one of them. The announcement. As the flight neared its final hour, the purser's voice came over the intercom, his tone professional but carrying a subtle note of excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you're enjoying your flight today. Before we begin our descent into London Heathrow, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest on board with us. Seated in business class is Mr. Daniel Grant, the owner of SkyPoint Airways and a leader in the global aviation industry. Mr. Grant's recent acquisition of this airline marks a new and exciting chapter for us, and we're honored to have him on board. The cabin fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the engines. Then, there was a scattering of applause from a few passengers, those who likely respected Daniel's accomplishments regardless of earlier judgments. Others sat stiffly in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Daniel gave a small nod of acknowledgement to the crew, appreciating their gesture. It hadn't been necessary, but he understood their pride in the announcement. After all, the airline's future was brighter than it had been in years, and his leadership was at the center of that transformation. A lesson learned. As the plane began its descent, Daniel closed his tablet and leaned back, reflecting on the irony of the situation. He hadn't boarded this flight for recognition or validation, he had boarded as a businessman, a leader, and, most importantly, a human being looking to travel in peace. He didn't need their applause or approval. But perhaps, for those who had judged him, this experience would be a lesson, one that would linger long after they disembarked. When the plane touched down, passengers began gathering their belongings, murmuring their goodbyes to the crew. Daniel took his time, letting others file out first. As he stood to leave, the gray-haired woman turned slightly in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Grant," she said softly, her voice hesitant, "I'm so sorry for earlier. I made a mistake." Daniel regarded her with a calm, steady gaze. "We all make mistakes," he replied simply, offering her a small, understanding smile. She looked relieved but humbled, as though his grace had been a gift she didn't deserve. As Daniel walked off the plane and into the terminal, he felt no bitterness or anger. Instead, he felt a quiet pride in how far he had come, not just in business, but in life. The whispers and judgments of others didn't define him. They never had. And as he walked toward the awaiting car that would take him to his next meeting, Daniel knew one thing for certain, there was still so much more he would achieve. The sky, after all, had no limits. A legacy in motion. Daniel stepped into the black luxury car waiting for him outside Heathrow Airport. The chauffeur, a polite, middle-aged gentleman in a sharp uniform, greeted him warmly, having already been briefed about his prestigious guest. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," the driver said, opening the door for him. "Welcome to London. Shall I take you straight to the hotel, or would you prefer to stop somewhere first?" "Straight to the hotel, please," Daniel replied with a calm nod. The car eased into the flow of London's morning traffic, gliding smoothly through the busy streets. As the city sprawled past him, Daniel let his thoughts wander. The view outside was familiar, landmarks, shops, and pedestrians buzzing with life, but his focus was elsewhere. He thought about what awaited him, a meeting with the newly acquired airline's executive team. Their company, once a storied European legacy carrier, had been faltering for years, bleeding revenue, burdened by outdated infrastructure, and suffering from leadership that lacked vision. This acquisition wasn't just business, it was personal. Daniel saw potential where others saw failure. SkyPoint Airways had grown from the ground up because he understood how to innovate, how to lead, and, most importantly, how to listen. He wasn't here to impose his will. He was here to inspire a transformation. For Daniel, turning struggling businesses into success stories was both an art and a science. As the car weaved through narrow lanes, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Clara, who had been managing the transition remotely. Her voice came through the car's Bluetooth system, clear and energetic as always. "Morning, Daniel. Just wanted to touch base before your meeting. The team is ready, and they've got a packed agenda for you. I prepped some briefing notes on the European operations. Numbers are still shaky, but I've included some growth projections based on your strategy." "Thanks, Clara. Send them to my tablet if you haven't already," Daniel said, his tone even and professional. "Already done," she replied. "Oh, and one more thing, there's been buzz in the press this morning about your flight here. Looks like someone leaked that you were on board. A few outlets are running pieces about how you quietly owned the cabin, even after the assumptions people made about you. They're calling it a power move without a word spoken." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "The press loves a story, don't they?" "They sure do," Clara replied. "But it's not a bad look for you. The article highlights how composed you were despite everything. Honestly, it's a great piece about leadership and rising above bias." Daniel's smile faded slightly as he reflected on her words. "Clara, people make assumptions because they've been conditioned to. The real story here isn't about me, it's about changing those narratives, creating new standards. I'm not here for power moves. I'm here to make progress." "Understood, Daniel," she said, her tone softening. "You've always got the bigger picture in mind. That's why you're the best at what you do." "Thanks, Clara. I'll call you after the meeting," Daniel said, ending the call. The executive team. The hotel conference room was sleek and modern, the kind of space where billion-dollar decisions were made. Daniel walked in with the quiet authority of someone who belonged there. Waiting for him around the table were the European Airlines executives, men and women in tailored suits, their faces a mixture of anticipation, curiosity, and, for some, skepticism. Daniel had encountered this before. A new owner, especially one who disrupted the norm, always brought a wave of uncertainty. Would he cut jobs? Would he dismantle the old systems that had defined the company for decades? The tension in the room was palpable. "Good morning, everyone," Daniel began, his voice calm but commanding as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Let's get started." The team launched into their reports, financial summaries, infrastructure breakdowns, passenger satisfaction data, pages and pages of numbers painting a picture of a struggling airline. Daniel listened intently, asking thoughtful questions when necessary but allowing the team to share openly. This wasn't a dictatorship. It was a conversation. At last, when the reports were done, all eyes turned to him. The room fell silent as the team waited to hear what their new owner had to say. Daniel leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the table. "Thank you for being candid with me today," he said. "I know this is a difficult time for all of you. The numbers aren't where they need to be, and I don't think anyone in this room would disagree with that." There were quiet murmurs of agreement. "But let me be clear," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger, "I didn't acquire this airline to tear it apart. I acquired it because I believe in its potential. I believe in your team, in your experience, and in your ability to turn this around. Change is coming, yes, but it's going to be strategic, collaborative, and sustainable." A few skeptical glances were exchanged. One of the executives, a stern-looking man with gray at his temples, spoke up. "With all due respect, Mr. Grant, we've heard these kinds of promises before. The airline industry isn't forgiving. Competitors are aggressive, and passenger loyalty is fleeting. What makes this different?" Daniel met the man's gaze directly, unflinching. "What makes this different," he said, "is that I don't just talk about change. I execute it. Look at SkyPoint Airways. 5 years ago, no one thought we could compete against the giants. Today, we're leading in customer satisfaction and profitability. How? Because we didn't just focus on cost cutting. We focused on innovation, on service, and on treating our people like partners, not assets. He paused, scanning the room. This isn't just about competing, it's about redefining what this airline can be. You've got history. You've got a name that people still trust. Now it's time to build on that. The room was silent, the energy shifting subtly. Doubt was giving way to curiosity, and curiosity was slowly turning into belief. Defining leadership. After the meeting, Daniel stayed behind to shake hands with each executive, making sure to thank them for their time and input. He believed in leading by example, and that meant treating everyone, regardless of their title, with respect. As the last executive left the room, Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction. This was only the beginning, but the foundation had been laid. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. Trust had to be earned, and momentum had to be built. But he also knew something else. People follow leaders who don't just talk, they inspire. They act. As Daniel walked toward the elevator, his phone buzzed with a message from Clara. Just saw the headlines. Looks like the press is catching on to what you've been building. They're calling you the quiet force transforming aviation. Daniel smiled faintly, typing a quick response. Good. Let the work speak for itself. Stepping out into the bright London afternoon, Daniel felt a surge of purpose. He didn't need accolades or approval. What he needed, what he wanted, was impact. And the world was starting to take notice. Shattering ceilings and building skies. The following months were a whirlwind of transformation. Daniel Grant's acquisition of the struggling European airline had sent ripples through the aviation industry. Analysts had been skeptical, competitors dismissive, and some in the media had labeled it a reckless gamble. But as always, Daniel's vision extended beyond what anyone else could see. In boardrooms and hangars, in press conferences and employee workshops, Daniel was everywhere. He didn't believe in leading from a distance, he showed up, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work alongside his team. He spent days walking the airline's operational hubs, meeting mechanics, engineers, ground crews, and pilots. No position was too small, and no employee was overlooked. To Daniel, the heart of any airline wasn't just its planes, it was its people. It was on one such visit, in the cavernous space of a maintenance hangar, that Daniel made his most significant impact yet. The human connection. The hangar buzzed with activity as teams worked on engines and fuselages, their hands stained with oil and their minds focused on precision. Daniel, dressed not in his typical tailored suit but in casual slacks and a company-branded jacket, moved through the hangar alongside the chief engineer, a wiry, sharp-eyed woman named Sophia Lopez. She had been with the company for 20 years and knew the airline's planes better than anyone. "You're really out here with us," Sophia said, half impressed and half incredulous as she watched Daniel listen attentively to one of the mechanics explaining a repair process. "Most CEOs only come to these places for photo ops." Daniel smiled as he wiped a faint streak of grease from his hands with a cloth. "If you don't understand how the work gets done, how can you lead?" "That's true," Sophia said thoughtfully. "But I'll be honest, when the acquisition first happened, a lot of us didn't know what to expect. People were worried. We've been burned before by promises from the top." Daniel nodded, leaning against a large engine as Sophia continued. He could see the weariness in her eyes, the remnants of trust broken by years of mismanagement. "That's exactly why I'm here," he replied. "I know the value of what you do. You keep these planes safe and in the sky. Without you, there's no airline, no passengers, no growth, nothing. I need you to believe in this vision as much as I do, because it won't work without you." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, her arms crossed. "What is your vision, Ben?" "For us. For this airline." Daniel's gaze sharpened, his voice steady and confident. "To make this airline not just profitable, but exceptional. For passengers and for employees. That means we modernize the fleet, optimize operations, and, most importantly, create a culture where everyone, from mechanics to executives, feels valued. Sophia tilted her head, skepticism flickering in her expression. You talk a good game, Mr. Grant, but words are easy. What's different this time? Actions, Daniel replied simply. You'll see it. And actions, he knew, were the only currency that mattered. The turnaround. True to his word, Daniel's strategy began taking shape quickly. New investments were made to upgrade the airline's aging fleet with state-of-the-art, fuel-efficient aircraft. Maintenance teams received improved tools and training programs to ensure precision and safety at every step. Customer experience became a central focus. Daniel personally oversaw changes to the cabin layouts, introducing innovations that improved passenger comfort without compromising profitability. His team developed tech-driven solutions to reduce delays and streamline booking processes, earning praise from travelers who had grown tired of clunky, outdated systems. But more importantly, Daniel prioritized his people. He established forums where employees at every level could voice concerns, suggest improvements, and feel heard. He implemented profit-sharing programs that rewarded hard work with tangible benefits, boosting morale and loyalty. Within months, the culture of mistrust that had plagued the airline for years began to fade. The change was gradual, but undeniable. Soon, passengers began to notice the difference. Flight crews were friendlier and more engaged. Planes were arriving on time, and customer satisfaction surveys showed a dramatic uptick. Business travelers praised the streamlined service, while leisure passengers raved about the comfort and affordability. Daniel had delivered on his promise. Recognition without validation. Months later, Daniel found himself seated at the head table of an industry awards ceremony in Zurich. The annual event brought together airline executives, innovators, and leaders from across the globe. It was a celebration of success, but also a space where reputations were solidified. SkyPoint Airways, under the leadership of Daniel Grant, has been awarded Airline Turnaround of the Year. The announcer's voice boomed across the ballroom. Applause filled the room, a sound that Daniel registered as both acknowledgement and irony. He rose to his feet, buttoning his tuxedo jacket, and walked to the stage, calm and composed. He could feel the eyes on him, those of admiration, curiosity, and even grudging respect. As he accepted the sleek glass award, the announcer added, Mr. Grant's vision has not only saved a legacy airline from collapse, but has also set a new standard for innovation and inclusivity in the aviation industry. Standing at the podium, Daniel took a moment to let the silence settle before he began. Thank you, he said simply, his voice carrying across the room. This award is not for me. It's for the thousands of people, pilots, mechanics, flight crews, engineers, and executives, who believed in what we could achieve together. He paused, scanning the room, meeting the eyes of industry leaders who had doubted him. A year ago, many people told me this turnaround was impossible. Some even told me I didn't belong here. But success isn't determined by where you come from or what others think you deserve. It's determined by vision, persistence, and a willingness to take risks when no one else will. The room fell silent, his words cutting through the polished crowd like a knife. I hope this reminds all of us, Daniel continued, that leadership isn't about who has the loudest voice or the highest title. It's about lifting others, driving change, and proving, through actions, not words, that barriers are meant to be broken. As Daniel stepped off the stage, the applause was thunderous. This time, it was different. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was respect. Full circle. The next day, Daniel boarded a flight back to the United States, seat 2A, as always. The business class cabin was quiet, the hum of the engines a familiar comfort. This time, there were no suspicious glances, no murmurs, no doubts about whether he belonged. But Daniel hadn't fought to prove he belonged in a seat on an airplane. He had fought to prove that ceilings could be shattered, and new heights could be reached. As the plane lifted into the sky, Daniel looked out the window at the endless horizon stretching before him. He smiled faintly, his mind already turning to the next challenge, the next vision, the next legacy to build. For Daniel Grant, the sky was never a limit. It was a canvas, and he had only just begun to paint.